David Petraeus, good to be
Ian,
with you.
good to be with you. Thanks.
So, this feels like a rather momentous Munich Security Conference. I mean, do you think that we are sort of heading back to the future?
Look, I think that Putin has had to have looked into the abyss or shaken the tree, and he sees what falls out, and it can't be real pleasing to him. I mean, he's managed to unite NATO in a way that nothing else has since the end of the Cold War, other than his annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass in 2014. I mean, he has really given NATO a reason to live again. This is the best time for NATO since the end of the Cold War.
You've been
Paradoxically,
coming to this conference for
I
a
have
long
since
time
since
now.
since I was in the mid '80s
I
when I was a
mean,
speechwriter for the Supreme
when's
Allied
the last
Commander.
time NATO felt this coherent?
Well, back in the Cold War,
Right.
and it was, in fact, my boss, the Supreme Allied Commander. You know, in those days, the SAC year was almost the king of Europe because, of course, you have the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact faced off with the West and NATO. Yeah, I think it's right to say there hasn't been that degree of unity. There have certainly been some missions that have been very important. I would say the Balkans missions in the 1990s were very, very important and unifying, Bosnia, Kosovo, and so forth. Um, Afghanistan was a NATO mission, of course, but the way it was ended, at least on this side of the Atlantic, is felt that there was not sufficient consultation. Many of them wanted to stay, and certainly the way that we ended up leaving was not the most orderly of departures. So yeah, this is really quite a striking moment. I also think you do have to actually understand the context for the U.S. delegation, the national security team, and that is that to a degree, Afghanistan forms that context and a recognition that whether they believe it or not in Washington, the Europeans did not feel adequately consulted. Look at the consultation they have done
And the
this time.
Russians saw an opportunity, perhaps, as a
Maybe
consequence.
it may be that that
Yeah.
this message that we were not a dependable partner and so forth. I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Afghanistan was something that was a one-off for the commander in chief in particular. So, but I do think, having been very critical of the administration over the decision to withdraw and the way it was done, that the conduct of what they're doing now has been very
It
impressive.
almost feels like a different administration in terms of both the communications, which they've done so much of in advance of the challenges with Russia over Ukraine, to the public, as well as the multilateralism.
Sure, yeah.
It's
Well, I mean,
night
number
and
one,
day.
people have their feet firmly on the ground. That was very early on in the beginning when the decision was made and then when the execution was carried out. Again, you have that context that we've got to show that we are a dependable partner, that we do consult, and that we have the will to employ the extraordinary capabilities that only we have. So it's a very different sense, and it's a very reassuring sense. Again, I give credit to the administration for what they have done and the way that they are very quickly taking what is undoubtedly sensitive intelligence and laundering it into releasable public information to put Russia on notice repeatedly is also very impressive.
That
So
if the
it's,
Russians
again, it's
engage in
this
a false
team.
flag, or if
Yes,
the Russians,
yeah,
that they
yeah,
will be
yeah,
seen to
yeah,
have been
yeah,
manipulating.
yeah.
in
Yeah, I mean,
advance.
it does help that you have the media, the social media, that you can follow this all on TikTok or on whatever is posted, so that literally drawing social media plus all of the other sources, and government does that too, of course. In
Now,
fact, the CIA has an open source center that mines all this stuff.
tell me, I mean, because you've got a lot of experience in terms of the disposition of forces that we're seeing right now, and I mean, yeah, it's a big buildup. I understand that. Talk a little bit about what it means for the Russians to
It's
have
huge.
put what they
Yeah,
have now
yeah,
arrayed
yeah.
across Ukraine's borders.
I think they have positioned a force that presents a number of options to President Putin.
Mm.
There's no question about that. I don't think that's indisputable.
Mm.
The question of obviously is, does he really, truly, want to go in from, gosh, I don't know, you come in from the north and the south and, have a pincer and shut it off and encircle the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine or something. Does he really want to try to digest what we believe will be a porcupine that will not go down easily?
What can you say about the Ukrainian forces, their preparedness, as well as the weapons systems that have been sent by the United States
Yep.
and NATO allies to Ukraine?
Yep. A lot better than 2014,
Mhm.
which frankly is from a pretty low baseline quite a bit. I've actually been to the front, if you will, of the Donbass. I went out 3 years ago before the lockdown, visit with Ukrainian troops and all the Ukrainian leaders back in Kyiv as well.
So-called line of contact. Yeah.
It is. I mean, it's dug in. This is World War I with drones, optics, and computers in the command post, but still mud and still trenches. And if you pop your head above the ground for too long, there's a sniper on the other side who might take it off. So it's deadly serious. There are casualties every single week. But those lines haven't moved much in recent years. Ukraine took this hill back, or a little adjustment here and there, but by and large, it is a frozen conflict in that regard.
And what about these weapon systems? Again, the Germans sent like 5,000 helmets. Everyone's embarrassed, but I mean, the systems that have been sent from the UK, from the United States, from others to Ukraine, symbolic or actually meaningful?
Oh no, the man-portable anti-tank system and the man-portable anti-aircraft system, especially the anti-tank system, the Javelin, is a very lethal weapon. I'm not sure I'd want to be shooting it head on at a tank, but those tanks have to stop sooner or later. And if there are people with javelins within, a mile and a half or so, that's a good distance. They're going to take them out. It's a very good down payment, maybe a bit more than that. Again, but then, give credit to the UK. They were the first ones that landed C-17s on the ground in Ukraine with lethal equipment. So again, none of this is not offensive stuff. Again, you're not going to run to Moscow with this anti-tank system on your shoulder. But it sure is pretty good if you want to make the invader pay a very heavy price. The real question, of course, is how fiercely would the Ukrainian forces and the partisan brigades? Keep in mind, there aren't just several dozen conventional military brigades. There are several dozen partisan brigades. And if they want to put up resistance, it'd be a very, very difficult situation for the Russians. I mean, you're not going to go outside your perimeter without, again, someone taking a shot at you, and maybe even in the perimeter. So the other thing is, again, keep in mind the numbers. These sound enormous, 130, maybe even 150,000 troops, as President Biden said the other day. That's about what we had in the invasion of Iraq. That was nowhere near enough, even for just
to hold
part of the country.
To hold the cities.
Just part of the country. We couldn't even, nowhere near enough.
I vaguely remember a story from you around Najaf.
Well, I called up my boss and I said, hey, this is the very first big city that we take. There was some resistance, a couple days of fighting, then it sort of melted away. But now you're left with a city of 500,000 or 600,000 people. And at that time, they were still applauding. They were, well, of course, it's a Shia city, happy to see the Sunni Arab leader be cast out.
Yeah.
But I remember calling my boss on the radio and I said, I got good news and bad news. He said, it's good news. I said, we own Najaf. And by the way, it's also the holiest city in Shia Islam.
Yeah.
He said, what's the bad news? I said, we own Najaf. I mean, what do you want us to do with it? And we ended up with an entire brigade combat team pinned down, just sort of administering it. And there wasn't even really much resistance left at all.
I think if you're calling Putin from Ukraine, you probably just give him the good news.
You probably do. In fact, I'm not sure there's a response. The channels, remember the old Soviet army, you could only call down, not back up. But the reality is that he knows enough to realize that, okay, they could probably run the government out of Kyiv. Actually, most of them are here right now, keep them from landing back there. But how do you hold it? It's not about taking part of the country or a good bit of it, even the capital. It's about how do you hang on to it. And that's not a trivial issue.
Yeah. So before we close, I should ask you at least a little bit about Afghanistan. Of course, there's a very different story in terms of how the Biden administration handled that.
Yeah, very bleak situation.
And I mean, now we're facing a situation of potentially many millions of refugees from Afghanistan. We've got polio still running around in that country. I mean,
COVID is rampant.
I mean, so when you look at all of that, talk about, and I don't want to rehash the mistakes that were made then, but I would like to say, what, if anything, do you think the Americans, the allies, should be doing at this point, given the government that is now on the ground in Kabul?
And I think, to be fair, that our government and most are wrestling with how do we provide very substantial assistance. We just gave another $300 million over that, actually. We're the biggest donor by far. We need everybody else to get back to the table on this. The question is, how do you bring that to bear for the people without enabling the Taliban government, which we won't recognize, I'm sure, if ever. We're certainly not going to do it early on, especially when they haven't agreed to a whole variety of different issues that we have raised with them. not the least of which is, some 60,000 special immigrant visa holders or applicants. These are the
That are
battlefield
still there.
interpreters plus their family members. So
Mhm.
it's somewhere around 12, 15,000 of them plus family members. We have a moral obligation to them
To bring
and
them
a
to
lot
the
of
United
others.
States.
Yes, we do. We said you serve two years or more on the ground with our men and women as a battlefield interpreter, a TERP. Our son had one as a second lieutenant on the ground when I was the commander. In fact, he was a platoon leader. And we will give you a special immigrant visa. And we have not evacuated them. We did not get many of them out. We got a couple thousand at best.
But flights are leaving Afghanistan again.
Very, very small numbers. I literally just had an update from No One Left Behind that tracks all of this, and it's the influx is less than 100 of those that we count that we're focused on, which are again the special immigrant visa cases. But again, the big issue is this is a humanitarian catastrophe. It's fellow human beings. Again, regardless of the government, the circumstances that it took over, we have to figure out how to get help to them directly, and we need to do it a lot sooner rather than later. They're starving. I've seen numbers as much as a third to a half of the population, which could be as many still as
Facing
35, 36
starvation.
million. Facing starvation
Winter. Yeah.
by the UN definition. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very, very grim. I think we still have an obligation to the other Afghans as well, frankly. And so we've got to figure that one out. It's very, very concerning. It was at the top of the list before Ukraine, which is, in a sense, sucked the oxygen out of the Situation Room, as they say.
Were you dismayed, surprised at the political decision that half of the Afghan reserves, Taliban reserves, would be allocated to the 9/11?
Yeah,
victims?
I've been thinking that through with others candidly. I mean, at the end of the day, you can only say, look, domestic politics does actually intrude on foreign policy. I mean, it's a reality. Sort of get over it. I mean, that's a way of the president trying to get assistance to them by unfreezing part of this money, which will still be fought out in court, and then
Yeah.
also trying to satisfy what is a very legitimate legal case that's been advanced by those who suffered under extremists that were allowed to tolerated by the Taliban on their soil and subsequently. So again, this is one of those of, slicing the baby kind of
Yeah, you know what
decisions.
happens when you slice the baby.
Well, you do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. It doesn't turn out well for either side.
David.
But again, that's reality in Washington, and we can say politics stops at the water's edge and all that stuff, but it's in everything really.
David Petraeus.
Pleasure.
Thank you
Great
very
to
much.
be with you, Ian.
Yes, you
Thanks.
did.
You bet.